Hey there, I'm Nick, a former Amazon bar raiser who's interviewed hundreds of Amazon candidates. And in this video, I will show you how to prepare your interview stories for the Amazon leadership principles exactly the way that Amazon evaluates them in a system that maps across the leadership principles and the structure of the interview loop. I will do this in 4 parts. Part 1 is I'll describe which leadership principles Amazon doesn't even evaluate in their interviews. Part 2 is I'll talk about the trap of trying to match the leadership principles to your stories in a one-to-one relationship. Part 3, I will break the leadership principles into categories based on how easy these leadership principles are to demonstrate with your stories. And part 4 is I'll answer the question how many interview stories you need to prepare for a standard Amazon interview loop of 5 interviewers. All right, let's start with part 1, which Amazon leadership principles the company doesn't even evaluate in most of their interview loops. Amazon has 16 total leadership principles. There's a lot of them. And if you're trying to figure out which ones they're going to ask you during the loop, it might feel like you're a mad detective trying to figure out who's done it and trying to figure out these relationships and whatnot. I'm here to help you with that task and tell you that 4 of the 16 Amazon leadership principles are very rarely, if ever, asked during the Amazon interview loops. These 4 leadership principles are frugality, strive to be Earth's best employer, success and scale, drive broad responsibility, and for a lot of us who are interviewing for individual contributor roles, hire and develop the best. You're not going to be asked hire and develop the best questions for an IC role. One of the reasons why Amazon does not evaluate these 4 leadership principles in their loops is because Amazon practices fractal interviewing in their loops. This means that each interviewer is given 2 to 3 areas to exclusively drill into, and no one else looks at those areas but this one interviewer. This way, each interviewer evaluates deeply your performance against the bar for these 2 or 3 areas, and then when they get together to debrief, they combine the depth with breadth across 5 interviewers. Now, this very approach would preclude the interview loop of 5 being able to evaluate more than 10 to 12 leadership principles. That's why the 4 leadership principles that I mentioned usually are left by the wayside. Okay, part number 2 is how not to fall into the trap of matching your accomplishments and stories with leadership principles on a one-to-one relationship. It is very tempting to try to find a one-to-one relationship like a key fits inside of a lock for each leadership principle with your stories. And the logic would go that Amazon has 16 leadership principles, therefore you need to prepare 16 stories, done and dusted. Do not make that mistake. The goal of the Amazon interviewer is to evaluate you deeply and fractally on the 2 to 3 areas that the hiring manager has given them. The interviewer will do this by usually asking you an average of 2 questions per each area that they're given. Therefore, you should prepare 2 stories, or better yet, 3 stories for each Amazon leadership principles. You may be now thinking, Nick is crazy. He's telling me to prepare 3 times 12 leadership principles, 30 plus stories for my interview with Amazon. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'll answer the question shortly, how many stories you should prepare for the average Amazon interview loop of 5 interviewers. But before I do that, I want to give you more context behind my answer. And that context comes in part 3, which is how to segment the different leadership principles based on how easy they are to demonstrate with your interview answers. Depending on how easy the Amazon leadership principles are to demonstrate, they fall into 3 buckets, into 3 categories. Category number 1 are the always on LPs, the LPs that are always on, as I call them. And those are the easiest leadership principles to demonstrate. Those leadership principles include customer obsession, deliver results, ownership, bias for action, and dive deep. Any of your interview stories, any star story, if it's a good story, will effectively demonstrate all of these leadership principles. So if you hypothetically came up with 30 interview answers ahead of time, you will demonstrate each of these 5 leadership principles 30 times over. These are the always on leadership principles. They're fun to prepare for and they're easy to demonstrate. Category number 2 are the intentional leadership principles. There's 4 leadership principles that fall into this category. These leadership principles are usually present in most of your stories, but they're kind of dormant, they're latent. You need to be intentional and explicit when you describe the story so that you would surface, you would illustrate those leadership principles. And last but not least come the targeted leadership principles. There's three of those: thinking big, backbone, and write a lot. Those leadership principles are hard to demonstrate. They're targeted. If you remember, I used the earlier analogy with a key fitting inside a lock. These leadership principles are exactly that. If you have to demonstrate these leadership principles, you need to almost think of a new story that is targeted to them. And effectively, for these three leadership principles, you have to prepare 6 or 9 stories that are focused just on them. Now, these 6 or 9 stories, or any story for that matter, that illustrates a targeted leadership principle, it will also demonstrate the always-on leadership principles. It will highly likely demonstrate the intentional leadership principles as well. But that's where your mapping and your planning comes into play. You want to make sure that you have good coverage of 3 deep accomplishments or failures for each of these principles. And by knowing this categorization of easy, medium, and hard to demonstrate is going to help you load balance your stories across the leadership principles with the maximum impact and the maximum effect. All right, so here comes finally part 4, where I will answer the question how many stories you need to prepare for a interview loop of 5 Amazon interviewers. The answer right off the get-go is I suggest 25 star behavioral accomplishments and failures for a loop of 5 Amazonians. And I'm sharing with you here a working backwards map and logic that explains my rationale. All right, so we start with step 1 here on this quick flow chart, where, as I mentioned, each interviewer is looking at 2 or 3 areas commissioned to them by the hiring manager. Then in step 2, each interviewer is likely going to ask you 2 questions for each of these 2 or 3 areas, which gets you to about 5 or 6 unique questions in each interview, each one-on-one interview with an interviewer that you're going to have. Then step 3 is when you gross that number up across 5 interviews during the loop, you're looking at a total of 25 to 30 total questions across an Amazon interview loop of 5 people. Then step 4 is we need to subtract some of the other questions that you're going to hear during the loop. They're not going to be only behavioral. Behavioral star-based questions are going to be the lion's share of the questions you hear, but you're also going to get tell me about yourself questions, why Amazon questions, and functional questions, technical questions, questions that are evaluating your subject matter expertise in your field of work. So we subtract in step 4 roughly 5 or 6 occasions of the Team A, tell me about yourself and why Amazon questions that you're going to hear, and also another 5 or 6 functional subject matter expertise questions, which gets us to step 5, the final step of roughly 15 to 20 behavioral questions you'll get in a 5-person loop. Therefore, to over-prepare and be ready no matter what, I suggest that you have 25 star stories ahead of time. Does this mean that every single Amazon interview loop of 5 is going to ask 20 questions, 20 behavioral questions? No, the answer is no. In some cases, you could get fewer questions than this, and that's totally fine. You could get 5, 10, 15 questions in some cases. But I want to over-prepare you because what can surprise you can't hurt you. So stop preparing like everyone else. Instead, focus only on the 12 leadership principles that Amazon's going to ask you in the loop, and then map those leadership principles and your stories across the 3 leadership principle categories of easy to demo, medium to demo, hard to demo, and make sure that you have at least 2 or better yet 3 answers, 3 stories prepared for each of those leadership principles in that matrix that I just described. All right, now that you know how to prepare your interview stories for the Amazon leadership principles, you're ready to take the next step and watch this video here next, where I describe in a lot of detail how to land your dream Amazon job and I take you step by step through every step of the Amazon interview process. Watch this video here next, and I'll see you there soon. Take care.